Let's continue with having a discussion about how the design specification relates to the implementation. And this is really the focus that I want you to get out of the object-oriented design lesson. We've talked about three kinds of diagrams: the use case, which tells about the goals of the system, the software that you're building; the class diagrams, which is really, that will describe the components, the component specifications. Each component is a class, and from that class we instantiate the objects that have the characteristics of that class. And the third one is the interaction diagram. The interaction diagram shows how the component specifications are used so that objects will interact in the right way to achieve the use cases. So I'm going to focus here on the enzyme analysis use case. The part one, I'm going to go through in some detail right now and show how to go from a combination of the component specifications. So we're going to look at the components enzyme analyzer, that class, and CSV file reader, and how we go from this to code. Now, what we're going to be describing here is what I've called a skeleton implementation, and that means it's all about getting the methods written, the right method interfaces. So that means what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and that these methods in the various classes call the right other methods in other classes. And so what this will do is make sure that sort of the high-level pieces fit together, and then it's a second level of work, of effort, then to make sure that we get the right implementation of each method, so the internals of the method are right. So what you'll see is, as we go through the implementation, we don't go very far. We just go far enough to be able to describe how one method will call other methods to get its work done. And the way we'll verify this is that, apologize for that, this is going to take just a second. I have this particular application that comes up every now and then. It just takes a very long time to load, and hopefully now, okay, it's going to go away in just a second. I apologize for all this. This is not an advertisement for this particular product, or that is the product. Visual Paradigm is the product I use to draw these diagrams. It's a good product. I've had good experience with it if you care to draw the diagrams, the detail that I've done here. Okay, let me continue. What we're going to do is we won't get into the details of implementing each method, only to the extent that one method needs to call other methods to get its job done. And then later on in test-driven development, that's when we'll get into the details of implementing methods. Okay, so let's start over here, and I want you to see how the component specifications relate to the implementation. So let's start here with the enzyme analyzer class, and I brought up over here code that I've written to implement enzyme analyzer. I think it's very common. There's a very common convention I use here that the class names begin with a capital letter. And if a class name is really a phrase, like enzyme analyzer, that's a phrase, there are two words there, then I use a capital to delineate each word in the phrase. So like enzyme begins with an E and analyzer begins with a capital A. Enzyme begins with capital E and analyzer begins with capital A. This corresponds to a file that has all lowercase, and it's separated by an underscore. So enzyme underscore analyzer, it's Python, so it's .py. I find this convention very convenient. To what extent it adds weight to this is the conventions we used at Google. I think many other companies use a similar kind of convention as they relate classes to files that implement those classes. Okay. So we see in our component specification over here, component specification has two parts to it. One is the attributes that are specified, and the other one is the methods. Now, it's important to understand that the specification over here is not complete. in the sense that this is not necessarily everything you need to implement the capability, the functionality of the class. So we may have other instance variables or attributes than file name, and we may have other methods besides the methods over here. Usually the init method is specified. I try to specify because then you know how to construct the class, but that may not always be the case. Okay, so let me show how that corresponds to the file over here that implements the enzyme analyzer class. So a common convention, a common expectation I have when I look at a class file is I want to see something about some high-level documentation of the class. So I'll see this file implements the enzyme analyzer use case. So I know something about what this class is about. That's rather brief. Maybe you want to have a little more description about what that use case is. I should also mention, although the this file enzyme_analyzer.py clearly implements the enzyme analyzer class, there may be other classes there too that are internal or utility classes that are needed, but those should be fairly minor. They shouldn't be significant, and they should not be used outside of this file. And again, that's a convention. It sort of localizes and isolates the code. All right, so the next part here you'll see are imports. So this is how we get other pieces of our program that are in other files. So we're going to use CSV file reader. Not surprising because we have the CSV file reader object over here. And then there's this utility file as well. And that's where I have the routine that's going to just basically print where we are. Again, I pointed out before, we're not going to implement much of the logic of each method. We just want to print where we are in the processing. Okay, so now let's get down to the class itself. So obviously we need a class statement. And so enzyme analyzer, it's at the top of the hierarchy in terms of inheritance. So it inherits from object. Typically, we'll want to have something in the way of documentation of that class. So this is, again, it's rather brief, but it shows that that's a good thing to have there. Now, we haven't talked about this before, but I mentioned that the variables we see over here, these are called instance variables or attributes of the class. They actually are separate variables for each object. You can also have variables that are common to all objects in the class. Those are called class variables. And here's an example of that. A variable that's defined at the top level here, reaction rate name. The fact that it's in all caps means that this is a constant. And that's a common convention that's used, whether it's a class variable, an instance variable, or a local variable. We'll have all caps, and then you separate phrases, words and phrases by underscores. So this variable I'm using primarily, well, this is actually something that is important to the class, and that is the way we're going to figure out which variables which in a file that we read is based on the variable name. So a variable name v, that's going to be the reaction rate name. That's important to us. Okay, so let's then get into more of the details of this, the implementation of this component here. So enzyme analyzer has two methods. It's a init method, which is used as a constructor, and analyze. Init takes one argument, file name. File name is a string. So we see over here, we define the init. Remember, it's a double underscore init double underscore. I tend not to include the double underscores when I put it over here in the component, but maybe you would prefer to do that. I think once you get in the habit of doing this, the double underscores seem a bit excessive. I'd like to have some documentation of each method, so certainly inputs and outputs, and as appropriate if the method is not sufficiently descriptive by its name, also what it does. So file name, it's a string, and it's the complete path for the file. Okay, and so then we see over here that the first statement I have here is this report, which is basically a print, comes out of the utility file, and it's just going to print out what routine I'm in, so enzyme analyzer, that class, the init method, and then identifies it in some way. So identify is coming from file name, which is the argument over here, and then I assign for each attribute or instance variable. You use self dot, and then I assign it the value of the argument in the constructor file name. So this over here, self dot file name, that corresponds to file name over here. That is a variable that's used in this object. Now we see that there are two other instance variables here. There's substrate concentration and reaction rate. These do not appear over here in the component specification. You could put them in if you wanted. Like I said, the component specification is not necessarily a complete description of everything you need. It's rather enough so that you understand how to implement the component. And it turns out, not surprisingly, in the implementation, as I was doing it, even in the skeletal implementation, I found it was really useful to have this variable, these two variables, the substrate concentration and the reaction rate. The value that is being assigned is none. None is a reserved word with a capital over here. Reserved word in Python. It means that there's literally no value has been assigned. By default, if you reference a variable that has not been previously assigned in Python, rather than being undefined, it's simply a variable with a value none. This is very useful in Python to distinguish when you have and have not made an assignment. We talked about this before. Otherwise, you get into funny situations where you have to designate special values as being none, like a -1. All right, so that's the init method. And you see what we've accomplished here is we're going to print something, and then we're going to do the assignment of the actual variables that are used in the method, but no more detail in terms of logic. And in fact, for init and for constructors in general, I try not to do much processing in a constructor because the object is in a funny state when you're executing the constructor. So I would actually recommend that you do no more than assign variable values. The other thing which I find is good practice here is that you can in fact create instance variables anywhere in an object. It doesn't have to be in the init method. But then when you're going to try and figure out what's going on with the object and its state, a lot of times one of the first questions you have are, what are its instance variables? So what I find is really good practice is you make sure that you assign all instance variables in the init project, even if in the init method, even if they're assigned a value of none. And the reason is this is a way of knowing everything about the state of that object. So just good practice. Okay, now the second method we have in this class is analyze. So analyze is basically going to do the work. And so analyze takes no arguments. So what we see over here is we see analyze takes no arguments. Remember that self is always got to be in. It's an implied argument for anything that is an instance method. It says that it's part of the object and therefore has access to all of the instance variables of that object. Once again, we're printing something out as we enter that method because that will be important in terms of showing that the use case is properly implemented. And then we see within analyze that we need to construct a CSV file reader object. Well, that's apparent from over here. We see that there's the init for CSV file reader. We need to construct that. We need to do a read. And then all these interactions over here that take place correspond to statements over here in analyze. So what we've done is say, okay, well, gee, we basically started with a specification over here. It says create a CSV file reader object. The argument for that that constructor is file name. Where do I get that? Where do I get file name? I get file name from the fact that file name is an instance variable for Enzyme Analyzer. So that's why the argument is self.filename. Given that I've gotten that object and I've constructed it, I can now invoke its methods. So CSV file reader has a method read, I hope. So if I go over here to the CSV file reader, I look down here and yep, it has a method read. So I can invoke that read. The other thing I'm going to do is going to do a get column names. Okay, get column names. Yes, I have that argument over there. Now, what's interesting over here, get column names, I actually have, I see I have a mistake over here. I'm sorry, no, this is fine. Get column names is just fine. Get column names, so I invoke it over here. This is the CSV file reader object. That's the object, then dot, and then I invoke its method. That gives me a list of column names. And now the next thing I need to do is there's some logic here to try and figure out which, what is the name of the substrate. Okay, because remember the way we figure this out, we've got a list of names over here. The way we figure out the name of the substrate is that it's the one that there are only 2 columns, because that's the structure we're expecting for the file that is being used for Enzyme Analyzer. So we're looking for the column name that is not a V, is not the reaction rate column. So what this is one of those comprehensions. And you can implement this as a loop too, but what it's saying is search through the list of file names. So here's column names, I'm sorry, of column names. So we got column names back here. Search through the list of column names. And if you find a column that's not the reaction rate column, return that. Okay, now what the thing in square brackets actually does is it produces a list. So it would produce a list with one element in it. So the way we get the name itself as opposed to a list is we look at that first element of that list of length 1, and we do that in Python with by this kind of indexing. And so this should be the name of our substrate. So now I have the name of the substrate. And so what I'm going to do is then I'm going to get the column data. Now get column data takes an argument which is string. That is the name of the column that comes out. It probably should have appeared here in the interaction diagram. I should have said something here about string. So then the substrate concentration, now we're looking at data. Remember, this substrate underscore concentration was an instance variable that I assigned to a value of none in the init. That substrate concentration then is going to be this value here. So the CSV file reader, I'm going to get the data for the substrate name, which was assigned up here. Okay, now let me explain something here because this has to do with the way Python does continuation lines. This line got pretty long because I used some long names. The way you do continuations in Python is you put something in parentheses. I mean, in MATLAB it would have been dot, 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 but that's the way you do it here. This is just to indicate a continuation. Now, the oh, that's interesting. Okay, this is actually a bug in my program. I'm going to fix this bug right now. You see, I said substrate concentration here. I do that twice. Okay, and what I really want is reaction rate. You see what I did there? So I'm going to change this to reaction rate while we talk. Reaction. See, and one of the nice things about Sublime is it'll remember the variable names. That's actually very nice. And then, of course, the other thing is you have to remember to save it. And so we're just going to save right there. Okay, got that fixed. Good. All right, so that's what we did with that method. Okay, now when we get done with doing these interactions, we'll actually want to run this code and actually run through this use case where you see this thing over here, this user that's over here to the left that does the init, does the analyze. So we need a way to do that, and the way I do that is I have a main program that's going to run this, and so this looks like a function. Def main is a function, and it does the init constructor for the enzyme analyzer, and then it runs analyze. So that's these 2 arrows over here. And then this last piece of the file down here, if name, and so this just says if you type in on the command line Python space enzyme underscore analyzer.py, so that means that this file then becomes the main, then run the main function. That's this over here. Okay, and then down here, so this shows what the main file looks like and how we implement all that. There's a corresponding file over here for CSV file reader, and you can follow through this as well and see it's done in the same way. There's a class. Let's see up here. So we start with the same structure. We've got comments at the top. We've got the imports that it uses. It uses this this class called variable, which combines, as we talked about in our lecture, it combines the data and the name. And then we've got some class documentation. We've got some class variables. These are used for, I probably should have put that these are tests. These are just being used here for the purposes of being able to run the skeletal code. We would actually strip these out later on. And then we see the init with, it does a report just to indicate we got there, and it has the instance variables assignment. So in this case, these instance variables were apparent from the class specification over here. We see file name, columns, and data. And we see the various types: string, list of strings, and dictionary. So this is a string file name which comes in the constructor. This is a list over here, columns, and this is a dictionary, and a dictionary is indicated by those curly brackets. Okay, and then the methods. We've got an init, a read, which we just looked at, a read, get column names, and get column data. And we see those corresponding over here, each one. And for each one, there's no logic to speak of here. I mean, like read is going to be a pretty sophisticated implementation, but we see very little here. We just see that there is a, it prints, which ultimately we strip out. It's adding the column names. This is basically is just saying if you want to append one list to another, that's what you do with extend. So this just says copy the column names into that empty instance variable. And then what it's doing is it's using that, so columns is this variable up here. It's a class variable, it's a constant. And this is really just for the skeletal implementation. It's copying the data over into the self.data. Okay, and that's really the end of the logic here. The main here, its purpose is to just provide some debugging. We'll do better with testing in another lecture. And as long as it's not the main program, which would be the case if we're running from Enzyme Analyzer, then the code main will actually not execute, and all we'll be using is just this class. All right, so that describes the mapping from enzyme analysis, use case part 1, to a code that we'd actually write. And what we're looking for is now we actually have code that can run. We can type in on the command line these commands. Let me see if I can hopefully this is where I want to be. Nope, it's not where I want to be. Okay, and shared code. So we are on lecture, I think this is lecture 10. Yeah, this is lecture 10. And look at that. Okay, so here are our files. And so what I would like to do now, let me clear this over here so we can see what's going to happen. So I'm actually going to run this code. And the way I'm going to run this code is I'm going to run the file enzyme underscore analyzer, py. And what this will do is when I type that in on the command line like that, what it will do is, actually let me overlay over here. What it will do is, by typing it in this way, enzyme underscore analyzer becomes the main program. So it's it will be known as underscore name underscore double underscore main double underscore. And so that will mean this if statement will execute. That means this function will execute. That function will do this over here. It will do the init of enzyme analyzer, and then it will actually run analyze. And then all the other logic we just constructed will flow. Okay, and so hopefully we will get out print statements that correspond to all of these interactions over here, most of them, whatever we've documented. Okay, so here's the prints, and these are formatted in that report function in util, util.py. So what we see is the first thing that happens is enzyme analyzer.init gets called for that file, test.csv. So that's this init right here. And then we invoke analyze, that's this right there. And then we get CSV file reader in there. It has an init, and then it has a read. There's its init, and there's its read and CSV file reader. Now, I've not shown the interactions with the variable class over here, but you can see that I've included reports, prints in variable class. You see that S and V get constructed. Then CSV file reader, we're getting column names over here, and returns a variable back. And so that variable is going to be, oh, I'm sorry. Here's the column names. and then it gives a list back of the column names, and then get data is going to return back a variable. So whatever it is we're asking for first, we've got the variables we constructed over there, and then we get another get data over there for this is the second get data over here, and then that's back here, and this return value comes in and some internal processing. So we see that these lines over here correspond to the code we've written, and so that gives us confidence that we've structured the code in a way so that the use case will be implemented. And then the next step, of course, is actually to fill out those individual methods. But what's nice about this is we've created this overall structure. And now we can go down to the next level of detail about the methods instead of trying to do the methods first and have methods potentially that we've missed, we've created that we didn't need, or they do the wrong thing. Okay, well, let's see here. So the homework for this, if we go back here to the homework, so the homework for this assignment is going to be to do the skeletal implementation for the other two parts of the enzyme analysis use case. And once you have each class in a separate file, pass the return arguments in the right type, and then, but all you need to do internally, you don't have to worry about the logic. You're just going to do these print statements. All right, well, let me know if you have further questions or issues with this.